foremost that we are for residents. We're about the residents. We will run honest, transparent governments for our residents towards rebuilding our city. Those are things we're not willing to compromise on. I think if we can find each other on those basic principles, then we can start looking into policies and, manifesto offerings of the different parties. And where there's commonalities and where there's differences, I do believe there's room for robust debate to look at whether we can find each other. So I think the willingness to be more collaborative by all the parties will really assist the process going forward.
Good Wednesday night. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am Thabo Mdluli. Will the minority governments hold, or is it basically a house of cards? Tonight, we are in conversation with DA Leader John Steenhuisen, whose party is now in control of key metropolitan municipalities across the country through unsolicited support of other small opposition parties. John, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight on In Focus.
Good evening, Thabo. Great to be with you and great to be with all the viewers as well.
Been a busy couple of days with a surprise that has been thrown at the Democratic Alliance. Essentially, you have exactly what you didn't want coming into these elections, a minority coalition government without written agreements in place, pretty much dependent on the support of the EFF.
Well, I think that certainly that's not the case in a place like Tshwane, but certainly Joburg and Ekurhuleni, yes. And the focus, as I've said already, is going to be now in the next days and weeks, is on solidifying majority blocks in those councils so that we can have a majority government. I think it is possible in Joburg, and we will be talking to parties that weren't necessarily part of the voting bloc even, to see how we can get them on board to be able to shore up and stabilize those governments so that we can have a clear way forward for the next 5 years, and we can get down to the thing that matters most. And I think that's service delivery. That's what the people in those municipalities want more than ever before. They've sent a very clear message. They don't want the ANC in government there anymore. And so we will try and form a government, but it's not going to be at all costs, Thabo, and I need to be very clear and upfront again this evening, as I was yesterday, that we don't want to govern at all costs. And if we're not able to reach consensus on a shared program of action and values and principles and on what we would like to achieve over those 5 years and to bring that stability, we will be more than prepared to go onto the opposition benches and be in opposition. But I think the parties have now put us in a position where they've said, well, we voted for your candidates now. You need to try and form a government and form a stable government. And we're going to try our very, very best with humility and in a very generous way to try and bring as many parties on board that share that program of action and those values and principles to form a majority in those cities.
What do you say to some who have reacted to your win in Ekurhuleni and in the city of Johannesburg as not a win, but rather a pretty smart political play from opposition parties forcing you to work with them?
Well, I think that's overstating it a bit. We're wearing the mayoral chains. It's DA candidates wearing those mayoral chains. And we will continue to wear them, but only on our own terms. No one is going to be able to hold a gun to our head and say, if you don't do this or do that, or appoint this person or give us this tender, we'll take you out of government. We will take ourselves out of government if that is what's going to be demanded of us. But I would sincerely think that the parties are trying to say that they imagine those cities in a post-ANC environment. And I think we've got a duty to try and form a level-headed, mature coming together of those parties around a program of action, not a your, my way or the highway attitude, but one that seeks to build a consensus that's going to focus on that service delivery model that delivers a better life for people in those metros and lifts people out of poverty and into opportunity.
But that seems to be Helen Zille's position, that it is our way or, well, we might as well go into opposition. Is the Democratic Alliance mature enough to concede that the electorate didn't give you an outright majority, and so they don't want you to barrel down the lane with your own party's manifesto, but they would like you to incorporate the other parties as well?
Well, Thabo, that's not been our position, and it's certainly not Helen Zille's position. What she's been very clear and what I've been clear on is that we will govern according to our values and principles. But I don't believe that governing by your values and principles means that you cannot find consensus with other people on a shared program of action and on those values and principles. I think what we've been very clear on is that we will govern where we've been entrusted according to those values and principles, and otherwise we won't be prepared to stand governments that involve themselves in rent-seeking and corruption and maladministration and tender diversion into other people's pockets. We would not stand a government that perpetrated those sorts of behavior, and I think that's the point. But of course, no party now in this environment, in these metros particularly, is going to be able to enforce its entire manifesto or will. It's going to have to be a melding together of the various ideas of those parties, and I believe we can find each other on the 10 to 15 things that we need to do in those municipalities to lift people out of poverty into opportunity, to create jobs, to build clean, accountable administrations that are corruption-free. These are things that transcend ideology. And I think that is going to be the task, and certainly one I've committed to doing over the next time. This is not the first rodeo for the DA in terms of coalitions. People forget the first major coalition in a metro was the city of Cape Town, where Helen Zille led an 8-party coalition over that course of that term of office. And of course, there's got to be give and take in those coalitions. And I've said we're more than happy to be humble and generous, but what we won't do is betray any values and principles that we've committed to the voters that we would protect and uphold.
So you yourself have said that in 2016, the DA had an unpleasant experience leading into a minority coalition that depended on the support of the EFF to stay in power. We as a party are committed to changing that in the next 5 years. What happens if the EFF doesn't come into that agreement and they want to continue giving you this support without having a signed agreement in place?
Well, it'll be very difficult, and we don't want to be in a situation where there's unstable governments. And this is very important. It's not just a DA opinion or view on this. Coalitions have had a very bad reputation over the last 5 years because you've had the instability where smaller parties particularly have flip-flopped between the bigger parties, and governments have changed hands or been placed under administration or knocked out of office. And we saw that in places like Nelson Mandela Bay and Johannesburg and other places. And it's very difficult to put in place particularly medium and long-term plans for a municipality and to bring that stability and growth that's required if you don't have that stability. So in Joburg, for instance, there are a number of parties that were not part of that opposition bloc who we believe we can bring on board to form a majority government there. Then obviously that would mean the EFF are then free to vote on a case-by-case basis, but that we will have a majority government in Joburg made up of opposition parties that will be able to implement that program of action. And as I've said, that's what we're committed to trying to achieve. And I've said very clearly as well that whether the coalitions last 5 days, 5 months or 5 years, that we will focus on a pro-poor agenda, on ensuring that we focus on getting the basics right and creating jobs and getting those cities working.
But is that not precisely the instability that we don't want to see in the metros, where you are there 5 days, tomorrow you're out, and tomorrow there's somebody else in there?
But what I'm saying to you is that we are trying very hard now to try and speak to other parties, to bring them on board, to form majority governments there, where we won't be in a minority government. That's obviously the first task at hand, is to try and shore up and stabilize those municipalities so that you're not in that situation that you've just described and are in a situation where you can govern effectively with the majority, as we should be able to do in Tshwane and Johannesburg. Ekurhuleni is slightly different, and the numbers there are quite significant, but obviously we're going to try our best to see what is in the realm of the possible there to achieve in that particular municipality.
The DA mayoral candidate in Ekurhuleni who pulled out, of course, when she weighed the options of your numbers, Refilwe Ntseke says she doesn't see that particular one holding at least past 5 years.
Well, I think that's going to be up to the people that are in those coalitions to decide how long they last for. A lot of people felt that Nelson Mandela Bay was the most stable coalition in the last round, and it was the first to fall. Everyone thought Joburg and Tshwane were the tenuous ones, and yet they lasted longer. So I think that there is an opportunity here for us to show voters, particularly ahead of the 2024 elections, that coalition government is a stable form of government that delivers and is able to change people's lives. And I think that I think opposition parties should be doing all they can now to make these things work, because you go then into the national and provincial elections in 30 months' time with a prospectus that you can put before voters and say, well, these are not the unstable beasts that they were the last 5 years. We've now shown you that we can have stable government that delivers, and you should trust us to do the same in your province or even in the country.
John Steenhuisen, did you double-cross Herman Mashaba?
No, the DA has never double-crossed anybody, and we've always negotiated in good faith, openly, and transparency. You can only double-cross somebody if you agree to something and then renege on your word afterwards. There was no agreement going into those votes. The talks had not yielded the results, and we had not acceded to some of the demands that we felt were not fair. So there was no agreement, and so there can be no double cross if there's no cross in the first place. So I think that opposition parties now need to be mature. I don't think that public bickering and slagging off of other parties is constructive or helpful in this time now when maturity and level heads are required. So I won't be engaging in slanging matches with other opposition leaders.
Well, he's slagging you off publicly because he says, that very evening you met with them and you said, no, we're not going to go to the media just yet, right? Guys, hold off. And then the next thing, they wake up on Saturday morning, they see you making a big announcement about you'll be fielding your own mayoral candidates.
Well, that is hardly a double cross, and there was also other agreements that I don't think were upheld. But as I say, that's not helpful to go back and finger point about what's happened in the past. We've got to now point towards the future. And I think we owe it to the voters in those cities to be mature and level-headed now about what is required. And I think we need to be open, honest, and frank with each other, and not debate coalitions in public arenas, but come together to be able to thrash out what is possible over the coming weeks, and to make sure that we can solidify those. And I'm certainly not going to be drawn into slanging matches with other leaders over the airwaves.
But do you think they will be coming back to that table with a degree of comfort in what you tell them? Because it seems they are saying, well, you say something behind closed doors, and you go out there in the public and say something completely different.
Well, as I said to you, Toba, that is not the case, and it never has been. We've negotiated in good faith throughout the process, and we will continue to do so. What they say and what they want to do is their business, but from the DA side, I'm assuring the voters that we're going to be humble and generous and very open-minded about what can be done, and we will go into those negotiations in that same good faith that we entered into the previous round.
So you're saying you don't care what they do, whether they bring a dictaphone into the meeting and record you, you're absolutely fine with that?
Well, I think that would be a show of bad faith, because there's some frank conversations that should stay between the coalition partners. And I think that it's precisely that type of maturity that's going to be required over these coming weeks if we're going to put something together. This is not a game of chess or checkers, as some have said. It's actually a game for the future of people's lives. And I think we owe it to the residents in those cities to try and build stable, constructive agreements that act at all times in the best interests of the residents of those cities, and focus like a laser beam on lifting people out of poverty, creating jobs, delivering services, and attracting investment. And I think that we can do that. And I'm committing myself and my party to achieving those goals over the coming weeks.
But why wouldn't you want to record it? You're going to make it public anyway. You said those agreements are going to be made public.
Well, I'm sure that you don't put your newsroom editors' meetings and your presenters' meetings are broadcasting. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that create the environment for those frank discussions. And I think if people feel they're being recorded or if there's a camera on them, that it entrenches people's populist positions rather than focuses on a negotiation. So I'm very happy, as I've said, to release all coalition agreements publicly, or once they've been concluded, and we'll have an announcement on that on Friday from Johannesburg. And I think that's our commitment to public transparency and accountability. But there's no board or private company or public company, for that instance, that has negotiations out in the public arena. And I don't think politics is any different to that.
We'll come back in a moment, John. I want to find out, why do smaller parties find your party arrogant when you go to negotiations? And why they feel, by and large, especially when you're negotiating with them, you don't negotiate in good faith. We'll continue in a moment. Leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen, staying with us. We're back in a moment.
Actually happened on Monday when the meeting was disrupted. We heard the numbers, and I'm just feeling sad today because we lost some of the members, primarily because most of them, they were complaining about, from the opposition, that is smaller parties, they were complaining about DA arrogance and some of the comments of Helen Zille and stuff like that. But I've tried to persuade them, and they couldn't take it. They were saying it's too much. They were finding themselves in a dilemma where you have the ANC corruption and arrogance, and DA racism and arrogance. Now, some of them, they were put in that kind of dilemma, and we lost some of them.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying on. Good questions for John Steenhuisen. Send them through to 072 110 5584. John, possibly having listened to that, I don't know what your reflection is, but it seems to me that Action SA is saying the reason why today you lost eThekwini is because of the arrogance of the Democratic Alliance when you deal with smaller parties.
Well, I think that's obviously in the imagination of the person that said that. We know why we lost eThekwini today. We know why the ANC needed 2 days to get things straightened out. And I think that in the fullness of time, those particular stories will start to emerge. But certainly, I think to try and blame the DA for that, I think is frankly a little bit of a bridge too far. I've had report backs from people that were in that meeting today who know exactly what went down and how those votes were obtained. And I'm sure that, as I said, that will emerge in time.
Speaking of how those votes were obtained, a tweet by Nicole Graham, who was your mayoral candidate in eThekwini, says the following. It says, a few small parties whose names you probably won't even know handed power back to the ANC in eThekwini. The IFP, EFF, DA, ACDP, Action SA didn't. Make no mistake, these guys have cash in their pockets and will hold them accountable. A few small parties whose names you won't even remember. In some interview, in fact, she called them a group of randoms. That's disrespectful, John. That is surely a sign of disrespect to smaller parties. Is that the view that you hold as a party? That there are few small parties whose names you won't even remember?
I don't think you can hold me accountable for somebody else's tweet, and maybe you need to speak to the person who tweeted that.
But she's your leader. She's your leader.
I wouldn't hold you accountable for...
No, but she's a leader in your party. She's a leader in your party.
I wouldn't hold you accountable for your editor's tweets or for Dolly Gumby's tweets. Your tweet.
No, John. Doesn't work like that.
Let me just say this. Sorry, can I just finish, please? Let me just say this, that I said we would go into these coalition negotiations with all parties in good faith. And we will listen, and we will be humble, and we will be generous in what we put on the table with any party that shares our values and principles. And so that door is open for discussions with those parties that share those values and principles.
How do you think the parties in KwaZulu-Natal feel today, having been
I don't know. You'd have to ask
a group
them.
Of randoms?
You'd have to ask them. I wouldn't know how to interpret their feelings.
Is that a gracious way of dealing with them when your mayoral candidate calls them a group of randoms?
Well, I said you'd have to speak to her about those.
No, what do you say as the leader?
Well, I say to you that my door is open to speak to any party that shares the values and principles and wants to build a strong, stable coalition that delivers people out of poverty, that builds cities that attract investment and create jobs, and which deliver services over the medium to long term. And we will deal and talk to anybody. And regardless of what any politician tweets in South Africa, if that is the case. I'm the leader of the party, and that is the position of the party.
It's not just any politician, but it's your mayoral candidate who you hope would have led the city of eThekwini. And this is why Makosikoza says other parties just couldn't take that.
Well, yes, so maybe you should have a television interview with Nicole Graham and invite her on, and you can have this discussion with her. I'm not on Twitter. I didn't see the comment, but I can say that as the party leader, my view and my approach is that we will talk to any parties that share the values and principles and share the objectives of building strong administrations, stable administrations that deliver services, create jobs, and create an environment where we can lift people out of poverty. And that remains the view of the leadership of the party. And it will be us who are leading the negotiations, not anybody else.
So you're distancing yourself from the comments?
No, I'm not distancing myself from the comments, Thabo. And I really think that this is a malicious line of questioning now, where you're trying to hold me accountable for somebody else's Twitter account. And I'm happy to take the brickbats, but this is a little bit unfair, I think.
Let's talk then about your strategy in Nelson Mandela Bay. Do you think Retief Odendaal should not have resigned? That was a bad move?
Well, it's not that he didn't resign. He didn't take up a seat in the council. He stayed on in the provincial legislature, as was his choice. But even if he was there, it would have been 60-60 and would have probably gone to a coin toss, and again would have been, I believe, that in a worse situation than any of the other metros, where you would have essentially had a motion of no confidence the following council meeting. We will take up our seats on the opposition benches in Nelson Mandela Bay, and we will be an excellent opposition there, just as we are in Parliament and in legislatures around the country. And that will be our focus over that period. And obviously, when people realize that things are not going to work out in Nelson Mandela Bay quite as they expected, we will hope that we will be able to form something there with those parties to be able to take back government at some stage.
And are you saying then part of your opposition strategy, there is no motion of no confidence at this particular stage?
Well, probably not at this particular stage until we can build an opposition bloc. And we've been very clear that even where we're going to go into the opposition benches, Thabo, that we are going to form opposition voting blocs. The thing about these, where we are in opposition, is that the numbers, like in a place like eThekwini, are so close that they're going to need the DA to pass budgets and to pass things like the IDP and make some key appointments, etc. Durban, as well, as you may know, is an executive committee system, so we will retain our 3 seats on the executive committee there, which puts us in a very powerful position as an opposition. I think that this new era where one-party domination has been broken in many municipalities means that opposition now can play a far more robust role in extracting concessions from whoever's in government in terms of budgets and the like. And that applies mutatis mutandis in municipalities where we will be in the governing blocks, where we will have to also seek consensus and compromise in many instances with parties across the political spectrum. That is the new politics, and you either adapt or you die, and I intend to make sure that my party adapts to the new normal and that we learn to navigate it quickly and effectively and show South Africans that we can have stable, effective government that delivers.
Yeah. Helen Ziller, and you'll tell me if you associate and align with these comments, or you are not going to align yourself with comments of somebody else.
Guess the tweet again.
No, she says the EFF leadership wanted the Johannesburg metro via back door, saying this was the party that wanted to influence the administration from behind the scenes. Do you align with that statement? And
yes, I do. I do align with that statement.
What does it mean? Explain what she's saying.
Well, it means that there was always a desire not to obtain political seats, but to obtain seats in the administration, because that is essentially where there are greater opportunities for rent seeking from within the administration. Councillors are not permitted to be part of tender processes by virtue of the municipal legislation and the MFMA. And so the real power to award tenders lies essentially with officials. But what we're going to make sure that we do is wherever we're in government, that we firewall municipal administrations from political influence, particularly when it comes to tenders and contracts, and that we as we've done in Cape Town and other governments where we're in government, is we open up those processes to greater public scrutiny, shine the light of interrogation onto them, and to make sure that those appointments, the tenders, contracts are all awarded in the full glare of the public gaze to prevent any backroom dealing or manipulation, whether it be by officials or by politicians.
All right, let's take a break. We'll come back and take more of your questions for John Steenhuisen, 072-110-5584. Otherwise, you tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. In Focus continues. We'll come back with the leader of the Democratic Alliance, John Steenhuisen. They've just, of course, had a clean sweep, if you look at it, in the Gauteng province, with, of course, mayorship in Ekurhuleni in the city of Johannesburg, as well as in Tshwane. And you can, of course, also count Mohale City on that list as well. Now, the question we were asking earlier on, John, is are you ready to govern by consensus? Because, I mean, essentially that is the same approach that was used by Herman Mashaba when he was your mayor, but that kind of got him into trouble with the party in a sense. And Popalatsi seemingly wanting to go in that similar direction.
Well, I think there's a very big difference between governing with consensus and governing in a way that's the antithesis of the values and principles of your organization. I have incredible faith in Dr. Popalatsi. I've spent a lot of time on the campaign trail with her. I believe she's a mature leader. I think she's somebody who has got the temperament, I think, to be able to bring people together around a common set of objectives. And that's certainly what the focus will be on, about trying to get a common program of action and some things that everybody can agree on. I think it would be very difficult for people to argue against increasing tariffs for indigent residents in the city. I think it's very difficult for people to argue against improving public transport and health facilities. So those sorts of things I think we can definitely find consensus on. And I've no doubt that Popalatsi, Randall Williams, as well as Tanya Campbell are going to be able to be mature individuals that will focus on putting egos aside and focusing on what's best for the residents of those cities, and that's why they've been chosen.
Right, question from one of our viewers says, what if the dream that John Steenhuisen is imagining in the metros doesn't materialize, or coalitions do not hold or are unworkable? What will the DA do?
Well, obviously, we're going to try and govern well, but if it's not possible, we will be honest with the public as well as with the other partners and say it's not possible for us to continue in a government where people want us to be involved in corruption and maladministration, or not to govern in the best interests of the residents, but put politicians' interests first. And as I've said very clearly in the broadcast I've done repeatedly, that we would be very prepared to walk onto the opposition benches and be an effective opposition. But I'm going to try my very best, and the DA is going to try its very best to be generous and humble with the other parties and to try and find that consensus so we can build stable governments. But we're not going to be in government for government's sake. There's only one thing worse than losing an election, and that's winning one and then governing badly and not according to your values and principles, because it's very hard to get people to trust you again thereafter. So we will do our best to bring that consensus. If it doesn't work, well, we'll return to the opposition benches and do our best in representing the residents from there.
Let's look at this tweet right quick and get John to respond to it at Newzroom 405. This is from Joseph Suping. As a nation, we are watching which party can't handle coalitions, and if DA continues with the attitude and that leads to the collapse, they must then forget about 2024. Currently, the country is putting its hope on him, and he must prove he can work with others and compromise. What do you say to Joseph?
Well, I'm very glad I'm not on Twitter anymore, for starters. But secondly, to say that we've already demonstrated that. We've been in many coalition governments for a very, very long time. And we've already demonstrated that we can govern and govern with them. And Tshwane, for instance, is a good example where we've had a number of parties on that make-o. Joburg, before Mr. Mashaba stepped down as mayor and left Johannesburg, we governed with other parties. This notion of arrogance and the like is not borne out by the record where we have been in government. We led an 8-party coalition in Cape Town that was very, very successful and put Cape Town on the track to becoming a good municipality again. We've been in coalitions at a provincial level before in 2 provinces. This notion of arrogance, I think, is something that really is a narrative being driven by some, but it's not borne out if one even does a cursory examination of where we've been in coalitions before that have been very successful and that have gone the distance and delivered.
Now, you mentioned that things are going to come out in the wash around how votes were acquired in eThekwini. Are you going to be opening up cases?
Well, obviously, we require the evidence, and I'm being very careful this evening not to make accusations until that evidence is gathered. But as we know in politics, as the Gupta leak showed us, as a variety of other things that have come to light since then, that these things don't stay secrets for long. And I have no doubt that once the first cracks in that edifice start to appear, that those stories will come tumbling out of the woodwork. And when that happens, people must understand that the Prevention of Organised Crime and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act makes it a criminal offence to coerce somebody with money to vote in a certain way or to act in a certain way. And certainly we'll be watching that situation very, very carefully as those fallouts will inevitably come.
Yeah. Coalitions have brought together, as they say, political parties from different or even conflicting ethnic, regional backgrounds. Does it force a degree of national cohesion in your view?
Well, I think it's a healthy development, actually. If you look at more mature democracies, certainly those democracies where a proportional representation system is applied, it will inevitably end up in coalitions. That's why many countries in Europe and other parts of the world that have that PR system end up in these coalitions. I think it's a healthy development. I think that a multiplicity of voices sitting around a table, problem solving, provided it's done constructively and in a good spirit and in the best interests of the people that have elected those people to represent them, I think it can be a very, very healthy development. And I certainly welcome the end of the era of one-party domination in South Africa, as certainly these elections have heralded, and a move towards a multiplicity of voices around the table, finding solutions for South Africa's problems. I think a lot of the problem that we've had is that there's only really been one dominant voice at a national government level. And I think it's robbed us of a proper debate around what we need to be doing to get our country off this low growth, high debt, high unemployment trajectory. And as that block starts to break up, I think the possibilities for South Africa are endless. And that's why I'm very, very keen to put together opposition coalitions that show South Africans that these types of government are actually stable, that they can act in the best interests of people, and that they can deliver.
John Steenhuisen, we appreciate your time, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Tob. It's been great to be with you, and thanks for the opportunity.
All right, leader of the Democratic Alliance there, John Steenhuisen. Democratic Alliance leader John Steenhuisen saying they are willing to negotiate humbly with other parties and put together governments in place that will see the people of the various metros in which they govern move forward.